welcome everybody to this very special session of the Homo Mimeticus seminar. It's the final year of the HOME project, which started in 2016, and it's amazing to see how time flies. And we've kept having these encounters over the years, and it's a very great pleasure for me to invite a figure who was there from the very beginning, who was involved in the Homo Mimeticus project. Actually, he was there when I first had the idea to apply for an ERC grant. And his name is Bill Connolly. I will introduce him properly in a moment. You will see that the name Jane Bennett is under William Connolly's name, and there is a mimetic confusion of identity here that is totally appropriate to the topic of this seminar. Jane Bennett and Bill Connolly share the same household. I'm sure Bill doesn't mind me sharing this information. So there are many resonances between their works and lives. And so I usually start the year by saying, well, I hope you had a nice summer. And the weather has been so extreme this summer that talking about the weather makes people uncomfortable, and it should make us uncomfortable. I'm based in Aachen, Germany, and we had severe floods over the summer. And Bill Connolly is placed on the East Coast. They just had an hurricane nearby, and in between across the world, you've heard of earthquakes, droughts, wildfires. And so indeed, the weather is a topic that is intruding in our daily lives, and it's an agentic force that we have to take seriously. Now, while the tendency might be to talk about the weather and continue with business as usual, there have been minor voices in a number of different disciplines that have been warning against climate change for some time. And William Connolly is one of those figures. He's a professor of political theory at Johns Hopkins University, where he has been teaching for many decades. And he's one of the most influential political theorists that has been writing over the past 50 years. His books are too numerous to mention literally, but I would like to mention just some titles among some recent books, because I think that there are concepts that speak and will be folded directly into our conversation today. I mentioned A World of Becoming, published in 2010. Most of his books have appeared with Duke University Press. The Fragility of Things, 2013. Aspirational Fascism, 2017. Facing the Planetary, also 2017, and most recently, Climate, Machines, Fascist Drives, and Truth in 2019. So it's obvious why Bill Connolly is the ideal figure to talk about Conrad and the planetary. But why Conrad and the planetary, you may ask? And so I just give you a brief contextual frame to situate the discussion that we are having today. It's actually a response to a specific demand that came from Robert Hampson, one of the co-editors of the journal The Conradian, who asked me in the spring if I was available to write something about Conrad and the planetary. And of course, the topic was eminently interesting to me, but I had spent quite some time writing a long book on Conrad that came out in 2016, where I talked about Conrad and the Anthropocene already. And so I thought that it would have been most productive to engage in a dialogue and a conversation with someone who has been theorizing the planetary much before I even started thinking about this question. And Bill Connolly immediately came to mind for the obvious reasons. The titles that I've just mentioned, Facing the Planetary in particular, is a landmark study on the question of planetary transformations in the age of the Anthropocene, but also for more personal reasons. I had the pleasure to meet Bill at Johns Hopkins, where I worked 5 or 6 years ago, and we've had a number of conversations over the years, but specifically when I was writing the Conrad book. I met Bill when I was wrapping up Conrad Shadow, and Bill was just finishing Facing the Planetary. And we have had a number of conversations in seminars and reading groups that influenced my thinking about Conrad and the planetary. So that was the most obvious reason for me to ask Bill, hey, Bill, can we continue the conversation that we are having on Homewood campus, just on Zoom? And Bill had the generosity to say yes. And so it is my great pleasure to have this conversation with him. So thanks so much, Bill, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to see you. And so maybe we said that the dialogue would be maybe the best format to establish a connection between Conrad and the planetary. But maybe if you agree, I'll start with some questions on my side first to get some concepts clarified, and then we'll have a back and forth as we planned. And so maybe just to start informally on this question of Conrad and the planetary. Many of you know that Joseph Conrad, of course, is a major figure in modernist European literature, and he is a global author in the sense that literally he is one of the most well-traveled authors in English literature, I would say global literature. And I use the notion of the global to call attention to the fact that Conrad's studies have been involved and implicated in issues of colonialism, colonial expansions, and imperialism and racism that have been central, for instance, to post-colonial studies. So we're all familiar, let's say, with a global Conrad. But a planetary Conrad is a different beast, it's a different problematic. And so I'd like to start by asking Bill if you could explain how you started thinking about the planetary, where this idea of the planetary came from, and can you define it a little bit for us? What do you mean with the planetary, and why is it important for the humanities in general to engage with planetary forces?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I look forward to the conversation again with you, Nidesh, and with others here, and I assume that when we get to the question period, I'll be able to see some faces, and that will be nice. Can you hear me well? Am I okay? Am I coming across clearly?
Perfectly, yes, absolutely.
So by the planetary, I mean, I got into it about 15 years ago when I decided that we in the humanities and social theory were not coming to terms with what was happening in the world, what was happening to the planet, and that even many kind of geological presentations and UN reports always turned out to be behind the times. They say this is the most probable, and then it turns out that they're almost always behind the times until very recently as to what actually happens. So it became key to me that understandings of planetary processes, non-human processes that have some self-organizing tendencies of their own, that are on trajectories or temporalities, and that sometimes intersect, that and making big differences to the world, that we had to try to make ourselves more aware of them, more aware of these processes and how they become imbricated with anthropogenic climate change. Because to put it crudely or firstly, the idea that you increase emissions and then you decrease emissions and temperatures and other things change and then they go down, that kind of notion of parallelism is at odds with the fact that planetary processes, once set in motion, have lives and tendencies and amplifying processes of their own. And so that's why we've reached the point where even if we stopped with these various emissions suddenly, the processes would still continue. What we can do now is mitigate and reduce. If we had been able to convince each other in 2000 to do the radical things, in numerous countries. We wouldn't be in that situation, but we're not. So the planetary is a set of cosmic and planetary forces that have some powers and self-organizing powers of their own. A simple one, in a way, is the micro processes of virus crossings from one species to another. A large scale one is the formation of the ocean conveyor system, which has profound effects on climate and moves the currents around the world. And millions of years ago, it wasn't there. And 12,700 years ago, it stopped, creating a little ice age. And then Wally Broecker, the guy who in the 70s, he's an oceanographer, presented all the views or the understandings of the ocean conveyor, says, looks to me like it could stop again. Most oceanographers said, we're skeptical of that. Today, most oceanographers that I know say that the ocean conveyor is once again turning. It's not going in the same direction to Greenland. That's its most fragile spot right there. It's turning, and it could stop, creating profound effects on climate. So that's one system. There are polar and mountain glacier flows. There are shifting El Ninos with their indirect but real effects on monsoon seasons. And monsoon seasons are sometimes interrupted, and they have been in India and China at the end of the 19th century with profound effects, and it goes on and on. Now, to be brief, these processes are imbricated with each other, and they're tied in and bound up with capitalist processes of deforestation and CO2 emissions and agricultural methane emissions and so forth. So I'm going to give one or two examples of kind of profound planetary events. And our knowledge of those didn't really come into being until after the 1980s. So one example recently explored is that a planet, not in this case, the asteroid 66 million years ago, everybody knows about that now, a planet called Theia hit the Earth. And the effect was probably the formation of the moon and some of the materials released to change the tilt of the Earth, probably, and to create materials from which the oceans could later form. So you could say that was an event that turned time. Einstein wouldn't like that one, but he talks about the curvature of time. And then, of course, you have the 250 million years ago when life almost went extinct. And we can now trace the probable sources and consequences of that much better than we could as late as, let's say, 1990. And then you have more proximate situations, like in 1897 and 1900, the monsoons are interrupted over India and China, and vast famines are introduced, and the British Empire refuses to respond to it. So you have planetary processes, some self-organizing powers. Now, how it works, how this makes a difference is that when we introduce through emissions of the sorts I just mentioned, increases in temperature and so forth, they set amplifiers, they set these processes into motion. I'm just going to mention a couple briefly. We have several amplifiers in play today, and we can understand the amplifiers because we increasingly understand how planetary processes work. They're triggered by the emissions. So a glacier starts to melt, water, melted ice absorbs much more of sun rays than ice does. And so it absorbs it instead of reflecting it back. And it's a simple but potent process of spiraling the speed of the glacier. Or the heating of oceans and tundra from accumulated CO2 emissions could release frozen methane clathrates that are sedimented in the ground, but also in the water at the bottom. And that would accelerate the warming process radically. To get back to the ocean conveyor system, melting glaciers in England could disrupt at the key trigger point where the water dives down and then runs along the bottom of the ocean. It could interrupt the conveyor at that key moment and stop it again. Some people, Broker before he died, and now Mann, who introduced some of the new research, has reluctantly and slowly come to see that. So I'm trying to explore the planetary processes with degrees of autonomy of their own and their imbrications with capitalist and neo-capitalist triggers that then set these amplifiers into motion and then the amplifiers intersect with each other. I don't know. That's probably too much or too little, but.
That's plenty. Thanks so much, Bill. And indeed, it helps clarify that the shift, specifically in Conrad studies, on literary studies, from the global to the planetary, implies paying close attention to these self-organized processes with agentic powers of their own. So this is very useful. Your work, along with Jane Bennett's work, but also Deepesh Chakrabarty, who has written recently a book on the planetary, call attention to the need to take these powers seriously. Now, maybe to follow up and to get closer to the literary work, I know that there are a lot of people with a literary background listening to us. Like figures like Bruno Latour, you've been paying attention to the agentic power of things for quite some time. I would say that what is distinctive about your particular genealogical interests is that you pay attention to what you like to call the minor tradition. And you're referring to Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari notion of minor literature, and you play on that notion of the minor that very often includes figures that straddle somehow the distinction between disciplines, between philosophy and literature, for instance, and have a certain attunement to aesthetic forces. So maybe can you, before we move into the world of Conrad studies, explain what you mean with this minor tradition and why aesthetics in general and literature in particular is important to your understanding of the planetary?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so you could say that participants in the major Western traditions with their different ideological views would include people like, to different degrees, people like Plato, Augustine, Kant, Hegel, Marx to some extent, Mill, Rawls, Habermas, Arendt, kind of all the people I grew up with. And so what Deleuze and Guattari kind of mark off as the minor tradition is a tradition that in various ways that has been contesting this tradition within Europe, this so far since ancient times. Now, what does the major tradition tend to presuppose? They presuppose climate gradualism. And that was the view that Darwin and Lyell, the latter, the great 19th century geologist, they said everything changes very, very gradually in geological, climate, oceanic, glacier processes. So you can kind of use the past as a measure of what will happen today. They saw no volatilities. These guys, the minor tradition, oftentimes resists the assumption of planetary gradualism. And that's what makes them minor, kind of shuffled to the side, because everybody knows, or everybody knew, that planetary gradualism is the only scientific view. That's what Lyell said, and that's why Cuvier was pushed to the sidelines and so forth. The second thing is that for that reason, the major tradition tends to assume sociocentrism, that the sources of changes or maintenance in a political economy or a society or a culture are themselves other social processes. I call this sociocentrism. And then oftentimes they press human exceptionalism. And so a triad, gradualism, sociocentrism, human exceptionalism. The minor tradition challenges all three. And so, but of course, not each one to the same degree. So when I think of the minor tradition now, I think of Hesiod's theogony, where the wars between the gods find expression in planetary processes. I think of the theophany in the book of Job. I think of Lucretius, of course, Spinoza to a degree, Nietzsche, Kafka, Deleuze and Guattari, Mary Shelley, Michel Serres, to a degree, of course, because nobody is completely in or out of this, to a degree, Alfred North Whitehead. And so they were already challenging many of these views and thinking about imbrications between the planetary and the cultural for a long time. So the denial of these things is not something that has always been with us. It was there and it was forgotten. And so I find it interesting or helpful to draw some sustenance from the minor tradition, sometimes at the beginning of a book, to kind of show people, hey, this, the theophany in the book of Job was very, very alert to these issues. Or in my recent kind of thinking, coming to terms with a figure like Michel Serres, who was also a sailor, like Conrad, who was very familiar with water and oceans and winds and so forth, and think about how they can help us now, right now, in our engagements, in our reflections back and forth with traditions that are outside our usual scope of inquiry. And it's understandable that they are, because geologists and physicists often make assumptions that we find problematic. It has to be a give and take back and forth. So that's very roughly what I would try to say is the minor tradition. And a lot of the figures in the minor tradition are thoughtful about mimesis, I think, as well.
So this brings us, I think, closer to the word of Conrad, because indeed one of my assumptions when I heard you speak of the minor tradition was that Conrad is a minor author in that specific theoretical sense that you indicate. Is very attentive to sudden shifts of temporalities during a typhoon. It doesn't treat the environment as a background for human agency, but it's very attentive to the back and forth between the environmental forces and the human forces. And naturally, so you mentioned Michel Serres, which I think provides a perfect bridge for our discussion, because I use a quote of Michel Serres at the beginning of the Conrad Shadow book, where Michel Serres says in The Natural Contract, speaking about nature and its rights, that so far we have not been paying attention to people who had direct experience to the weather, to the forces, to the environmental forces. And he says, sailors and peasants, they never had a say. And so indeed, as you remind us, Michel Serres was trained as a sailor, and Conrad spent a good part of his youth at sea. And so that's one of the reasons that Conrad is such a direct fit, it seems to me, for within the minor tradition, and can help us think about the planetary along the ways that you, Jen Bennett, Chakrabarty, and many others are proposing. So I think there we have a direct link that maybe allows us to transition a little bit more specifically to the word of Conrad.
So here's the book. I hope people can see it. Many of you have probably encountered it. Conrad Shadow, Catastrophe, Mimesis, Theory. And so you are engaging the planetary through Conrad in this book, but also maybe even spreading out or augmenting your notion, I'm not sure about this, of mimesis through this engagement with Conrad. So what you're doing is, if I understand it, and I've read some Conrad, I've read several books, but I haven't read myself, the ones that you focus on the most in this particular text. So you talk about these affective processes that form composite selves, the notion of the self and a double, that's not sufficient. I'd like to hear more about that. You focus on how the formation of community and sometimes panic out of potential catastrophe. And these are catastrophes emerging from, oftentimes, from a mix of planetary and social processes. And so at the beginning of the book, you see something that fascinates me. I think I have a sense of it, but here you are, you're right here. So you say, you seek to read fiction as theory, to read fiction as theory. And I would like to hear more about what you mean about that. And to set the context maybe a little bit, you sometimes say that there are theorists that you admire, such as Girard and Lacan and Nietzsche, and yet, especially I think with Lacan and Girard, you think that Conrad has a better theory of mimesis. I might be exaggerating here, than they do. And so that you're putting him into conversation with these theories. So maybe say a few words about reading fiction as theory, and then what you think about Conrad in relation to people, one or two of these figures, Girard or Lacan, Nietzsche, maybe not Nietzsche, because I think you are kind of Nietzschean. So the first two. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill, for this, I think, yeah, very important question. I mean, you're a political theorist yourself, so I don't need to convince you about the importance of theory for very practical issues, like what courses we teach, what authors we bring into the classroom, and what problems we deal with. The question is very important, I think, for a lot of our audience today, specifically in literary studies, where theory, I think, ran a little bit out of fashion. It's a bit unfashionable to talk about theory these days in literary studies, because the heyday of theory was, as everybody knows, the 70s and 80s with the rise of post-structuralism and deconstruction. And so we say, well, theory is dead. And indeed, I did decide to put the word theory in the title, and probably scared some people off with that gesture. So probably not very smart on my side. But so your question allows me to clarify one important point, that I'm not at all interested in taking a theory, no matter how brilliant, be it Girardian, Lacanian, or any theory, and just mapping it onto Conrad. I think that's become a dominant way of doing theory in literary studies that is detrimental to both theory and literature, quite frankly. And so that's why I like the fact that you emphasize that phrase, reading Conrad as theory, where the important word for me is reading. It's not theory. That is, the primary text, fiction, in this case, Conrad's novels, are really my starting point, and I treat them very seriously. What do I mean by treating them seriously? By reading them as best as I can. Analyzing, interpreting, close reading, this would be terms that could be used. Nietzsche would speak of philology. He was trained as a philologist, as you know, and he advocated very often the importance of what he called the art of reading. It's something that he says, for instance, in the genealogy of morals, that what is missing in modernity is the ability to ruminate. And it takes the examples of cows, which of course speaks to the Swiss in me, because I grew up around cows. So I know that they have 4 stomachs, and that it's a question of repetition. So reading requires time. And I would say that if one takes the time to read Conrad's fictions, theory is really not needed, or it becomes a conversation between the insights that emerge directly from Conrad's tales, and then a dialogue with the possibilities and limitations of other theories that I thought about, in this particular case, for instance, mimesis. So that would be the first point that I emphasize, that reading comes first, and that this art of interpretation is basically the soul of theory as I see it. Now, for your second question on mimesis, and now this treating Conrad as a theorist of mimesis, yes, I'm glad you say that, because the book received quite a good reviews, and happy to see that, but maybe it does not been emphasized or as much that in addition to offering accurate readings of novels or tales like Typhoon and Heart of Darkness and The Secret Agent and The Secret Sharer and so forth, which would be a critical activity that is of interest to anybody who's interested in Conrad, just to understand the tales better. The ambition was also to open it up outside of Conrad's studies and say, more generally, why should we read Conrad today? Which is exactly the way you framed the problematic. Why is it important that we read these novels? And I think that's I would call it a more theoretical question. And one of the insights that emerges from Conrad's work is that he has a theory of mimesis that is not anthropocentric. He is well known to have developed a theory of doubles, doppelgangers, the Homo duplex. And the examples that you gave, and I can maybe return to that later, are examples in which the double is indeed not sufficient. These are problematics that were internal to Girard, that were internal to Lacan's surrealist influences. But Conrad spent his life at sea. And so he is paying attention to forms of mimesis that are non-human and the way that they entangle, to use one of your concepts, the human in planetary forces. So I would say that's one of his contributions, the way I see it, for thinking about the planetary today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things that that struck me in this text, many things did, is that I think that you, with Conrad, are willing to treat the ship as a society, and that it's a small community, and it's in need of a commander who responds to emergency, but the commander is not a singular being. It has to be, and it's not just doubles, but it has to be a plural being with multiple facets at different levels of awareness to help the commander to both speak to an emergency and inspire the crew to follow him. So he says, and I'm quoting from you, that a storm has the power to overturn not only a ship, but the social microcosm the ship represents. So can you say a little bit more now about these non-human processes filtering, bumping, assaulting the human sensorium and different kinds of modes of response that you see in Conrad, both from the crew and the captain? And perhaps here is where you see affinities between Conrad and Nietzsche, because Nietzsche says the self is a social structure with multiple levels, and each level finds itself responding in different to different modes of influence from outside and digesting them, and then the crew intersecting with one another. So the ship is kind of teaching us about how these composite beings are formed and how to respond without panic to an emergency, or as you call it, catastrophic situation. Could you say more about that?
Thanks so much for that question. Indeed, the ship, and this you're perfectly placed to comment on it later on, because the ship has been traditionally considered as a locus classicus to thinking about the state, and you find it in Plato's Republic already, and you could trace the genealogy of that idea. And it's there in Conrad. The quotes that you mentioned come from The Shadow Line, which is one of his late texts and is often interpreted as a story of maturation, of individual maturation. There is a pandemic on board. And in that chapter, I try to pay attention to a pandemic on board, not only a ship, but Conrad calls it a state. It's a microcosm, that Conrad explicitly uses to think about political issues of sovereignty, for instance, and community and subject formation. And so what I find interesting in that analogy of the ship is that it allows for a certain articulation of two traditions, it seems to me. One is vertical. The captain is on top, and there is the first mate, the second mate, and Conrad works himself up this vertical hierarchy. And the romantic idea of captainship that emerges at the beginning of that tale is one of control, of the captain as being separate from the community. And then a pandemic breaks out. And so rather than treating the pandemic as metaphorical of something else, and that's something that Girard does in a famous essay on the plague, where he argues that the plague is metaphorical of a mimetic crisis of violence and hysteria. I thought, well, let's treat this pandemic literally. And it was in 2015. I was at Hopkins. So we're having these conversations about material processes. And I was reading stuff about epidemics because I was interested in figuring out how contagion works on board and to see what insight emerges from Conrad's diagnostic. And one of the diagnostic was very clear, that the head or the sovereign is attached to the body or the body politic. That in a situation of pandemic, there is no clear-cut opposition between the head and the body, the sovereign and the community, but forms of communal solidarities that take into account the agentic power of viruses in their destructive force, but also of currents and winds, and the entire situation is set in such a context in which the non-human dominates the tale, require a form of collective cooperation in order to affirm survival. So I was interested in diagnosing that dynamic. And so that's why I thought, well, I'm going to trust Conrad, trust the tale. That's one of D.H. Lawrence's, another figure in the minor tradition, according to Deleuze and Guattari. Trust the tale, not the author, and certainly not the theorist. So the tale said, well, the pandemic works in horizontal ways, in unpredictable ways that require a form of cooperation that is composite. And so the notion of the composite soul that you mentioned emerges from the shadow line. And I liked it because it resonates, as you pointed out, with Nietzsche's idea of the multiplicity of the souls. And it pays attention to the way non-human forces are part of this composition, of this assemblage, to use one of the words that you also use. And so maybe this allows me to throw you back the ball and ask you a question about these composite forces, because you're very attentive in your work on the planetary, and I'm thinking specifically of Facing the Planetary, which has a swarm on its cover, which is a mimetic figure in configuration. You're very attentive to forces rather than forms. You make that distinction early on in the book. You're attentive to planetary forces, and very often when you speak of the planetary, it's about those forces. And in particular, one of the chapters pays attention to what you like to call the visceral register of cultural life. Planetary forces operate on this visceral register, which whenever you use it with your examples, for me, I translate it as a mimetic register. Mimetic not in the sense that it represents reality, but that it generates fluxes of micro-imitation or contagion. So could you talk more about the importance of the visceral register in the context of your thinking about planetary forces?
Yeah, well, yes, a bit, but that's what I'm hoping to learn even more from you today. Nonetheless, I think that the processes that come into play, here's my reading of just one country now, the country that I unfortunately live in at the moment, the United States. You have these storms, you have these droughts, you have these wildfires, you have these more intense hurricanes with much more water falling, and some of the climate scientists who used to be viewed as outliers said this is what was going to happen, and it was happening. And you have what you might call climate deniers and climate casualists, climate deniers and climate casualists. Now, I'm thinking, and I want you to hopefully you can kind of augment or correct me on this. I'm thinking that the deniers today are people who sense in their bones from the experience of these phenomena and the panic or disquiet, depending on the situation they're in, that it foments. They first of all have that disquiet and or panic, and then other aspects of their lives kick in, and there's a kind of a preconscious sense that, hey, if we do all this stuff on climate change, I, as a working class male, might lose out, and I don't know whether they'll really take care of me or not in the future, because I don't see a past that reassures me on that respect. And so the first panic translates into the intensity of climate denial. And then I'm now talking about a different class of people, the class of people, I'm from the working class factory. My father was a factory worker, but obviously I'm not in it now. And so the people I go out to dinner with and so forth, and I would try to invoke the issue of the planetary at some point or not, stupid to do, but at dinner. And what I found was at those situations, an intense planetary casualism. Yes, there's a problem, but no, we don't want to focus on it. We don't want to pay attention to it. And so it's maybe time to think about what kind of double process works on people to say, yes, there's a problem, but what Nietzsche would say is that it's kind of a passive nihilism where in response to the new events, there are some remnants from the past assumptions that are still doing work on you. So I'm thinking about this process of mimesis, as you call it, as a kind of a double process. And in the country that I inhabit, which probably has more climate deniers than any country in the world, something like these processes are at work. And we have a hell of a hard time figuring out how to come to terms with it. Simple rejection doesn't seem to work. So if you think of us as selective absorbent machines who then synthesize what is absorbed before it reaches public and conscious levels, that's the way I'm thinking about the response to events. Events are occurrences that disturb or render you joyous, but they're surprising. And I think I'm not great at this, but I think that we have to come to terms with the multiple ways, levels at which responses to events become incorporated into the sensorium. That's what I would hope to try to do.
Thanks. Indeed, this question of incorporation, of rendering something that is exterior, interior, and crossing that boundary and generating changes, transformations, is also at the heart of what I try to do with this notion of mimesis, which is a double-edged sword. And Conrad was very attentive to both sides. I spoke before about the importance of community and solidarity. There is this moment in the shadow line where one of the mates tells the captain, "You and I are sailors." And that is kind of a tacit moment of communication that doesn't require anything more. There is a certain bond made through a common training, common practices, common experiences that establishes a bridge on which to build a form of sympathy, feeling with the other, that is mimetic in productive ways. But of course, Conrad was very attentive to the dark side of mimesis, Heart of Darkness being, of course, his most famous example, and how humans are vulnerable to what I call the pathologies of mimesis. And I think that what we're seeing with climate denialism and pandemic denialism and all these forms of resistance with respect to what you would call reality are indeed exploited by the pathological powers of mimesis that are at play in new media. There are a number of intersections that we could open up, but we don't have time. Conrad was very critical of the media of his times. Under Western Eyes and the Secret Agents contain very specific critiques of the media that seems to me perfectly timely today, even though they require a bit of updating because the media have gotten smarter in capturing the attention of what I call Homo mimeticus. But maybe to throw the ball back to you once again, and maybe we should also consider time a little bit so that we have enough time for people to ask some questions. Maybe on the notion of the event and temporality, which plays an important role in your recent thinking about the planetary. I had the pleasure to assist at a dialogue that you had with Deepesh Chakrabarty on the question of the planetary specifically, and you raised the question of different temporality, which is something that seems to me that is internal to Conrad's sensitivity as well. He makes a distinction between what he calls storm pieces and calm pieces. And these are very different works that operate on very different temporalities. In the calm pieces, nothing happened. There is just stasis, apparently, and all the changes and maturations that takes place inside. Whereas in the storm pieces, an example is Typhoon, for instance, or The Secret Chair, there are sudden changes in which a situation is completely overturned in ways that is unpredictable and unexpected. And you have been thinking about different temporalities. Can you talk about why is it important to think about time in the age of the Anthropocene beyond the familiar distinction that the Anthropocene is a geological epoch that operates in deep time, and human time, well, it's very short. It's a very short span with respect to the Anthropocene. So temporality is already internal to the concept of the Anthropocene, but you give it a different spin. Can you articulate it?
Yeah, a little bit. I think that what I'm trying to do now is to learn in lieu or in the situation of the Anthropocene to rethink the models of time that have been available to me as a political theorist. And so you have cyclical models, and there are many cycles that you can, there are cycles of seasons, and there are cycles of sunspots, and there are cycles of shifts in the Earth's tilt, and there are cycles of many, many more that could be listed. And then you think of linear time in which it advances along the course, and you can say, yeah, well, dinosaurs advanced for 115 million years, and then something wiped them up and many, many other species out. And then capitalism has been going forward for 400 years. It's not that long, really. And it could face, and it is facing transformative events. So I'm trying to argue with Michel Serres, and I think Deleuze and Guattari too, that both cyclical processes, cyclical temporalities and linear temporalities, and even dialectical temporalities are interrupted periodically by what you could call eventful time. And when that happens, a trajectory that was going in this direction turns and goes in that direction, or turns and goes in that direction. And events like this are usually the result of 2 or 3 temporalities that have been moving on their own course. And then for one reason or another, this one accelerates, and then they meet, they clash, they come together. And so the most obvious one, I mean, just very, very blunt ones are like Theia hitting the Earth. It was on one course and the Earth was on another course, and then all hell broke loose, but we weren't there. So after these eventual turns, you have to extrapolate to new possibilities. You have to explore how to turn your own thinking, your own political responses. And that resistance is part of the resistances built into denialism and casualism today, in my sense, or in my reading of it. So I'm trying to think about, with Serres, eventual time in response to, sorry about that phone. I'm trying to think about eventual time as that which interrupts both periodically, both cyclical and linear time? And then what kind of an ethic, what kind of a political orientation? Because I think we live in an age where these kinds of events are happening at increasing regularity. They've happened many times, but they're happening at increasing regularity. And there are theological investments and there are scientific investments in images of time that would resist coming to terms with evental time. That's why I think I would like, if I could grow up, I would like to put people like Michel Serres and Melville and Conrad and Nietzsche into conversation today, because I think all of them are alert to, in different ways, to multiple temporalities of different sorts that sometimes coalesce or speed up. They come to terms with it, but if you think today that in the United States, at least, there's an evangelical neoliberal resonance machine. One of them has a notion of end times, linear processes in end times, and the other one has the notion that we must pretend that capitalism can keep advancing at a faster and faster rate. If you think of them as having formed a machine, people like me and a lot of geologists and you and others are saying things that hit them right in the gut and it hit them existentially. And the answer is no, we're not going to think about that. No, this upsets us too existentially, but we'll never admit that to you. What we will admit to you is that we don't believe what you're saying. So I'm trying to think right now about a notion of evental time, practices of evental time that interrupt both linear and cyclical processes.
Indeed, and I hope that we have a lot of young listeners who can imagine possible topics for research, bringing Melville, Conrad, and Nietzsche together to think about such issues. I think what is crucial and what emerges out of this conversation for me, and it's always the case when I talk to you, is the importance of crossing disciplinary binaries and boundaries, be it the binary between nature and culture that dominated so much thinking in the 20th century, and that figures like Conrad in his writings dissolved and challenged and problematized from the very beginning, but also disciplinary boundaries in kind of drawing on different competences. And Michel Serres is indeed a good example of somebody with an interest in mathematics, doing philosophy, and having a training as a sailor as well. So these intersectional competences seem to be crucial. And that's why I hope that Conrad as a figure who is indeed at the intersection of cultures, at the intersection of languages, of course, because that's a technique too. He wrote in his fourth language, and also has opened up so many important debates for the global period. And I'm thinking of figures like J. Hillis Miller for deconstruction, or Fred Jameson for Marxism, or Edward Said for post-colonial studies, who all at some point gravitated intensely towards Conrad in order to think about the global. It seems to me that the same kind of effort needs to be done for Conrad in the planetary age. And your work, I think, provides very rich and productive lines of inquiry to explore. So I would have many, many more questions and things to discuss, but maybe just one last one before we open it up to the Q&A and have a more pluralistic discussion, since you're a pluralist political theorist, let's not forget. Maybe a question on temporality, which is very practical and down to earth. I mentioned before that reading, and certainly reading a complex author like Conrad, requires time, it's rumination, repetition, and the time that is needed for this practice of close reading, of analysis, of interpretation, seems to be in tension with the fast changing times in which we're in. We look at the news, there is a hurricane, hitting faster than we can read the next novel. And so I was wondering, in your work, you're incredibly busy, you teach, you are engaging with the tradition in political theory, supplemented by the minor tradition in philosophy, supplemented by all your readings that you do in the earth system sciences and biology. And we talked about all those books. But you always take the time to read a novel. One of the last time we met in Germany, you were reading Melville Moby Dick, for instance, which is not the shortest novel to read. You mentioned at some point I'd like to reread Nostromo, which you had read early on and you like to reread. So these are all long novels, complex, that require time and somehow at odds with the speed that is required from us in the digital age. So why do you think it's always worth? And I asked you the question because I think it matters that it comes from a political theorist, and that's relatively rare to have somebody like you who is taking time to read novels, close read movies, engage with aesthetics, paintings, and so forth. Why is it important to face the planetary? Why is aesthetics crucial to your thinking about the planetary? And why should we add a figure like Conrad to the discussion about theories of the Anthropocene and the planetary?
Yeah, well, it may be that if you think that professionals are people who think that the contours of their field are is a sufficient boundaries within which to work, and intellectuals are people who try to follow the problem, the concern, wherever it takes them. This debate between them is a major struggle within universities, at least in the States, and I'm sure it is in Europe too. So that the question is how to cultivate ourselves as intellectuals. And one of the many things is, first of all, you were defined by the problem. Okay, you're going to have to read these 7 climate scientists. Too bad, they may not be the best writers, although a few of them are. A few of them are really good writers. And then you go back and forth between pursuing the analysis of the problem and dwelling in a situation that is full of uncertainty for you, and you have to learn new things. And we have to do that in this process of rumination, and the cow's rumen is the intake and the digestion, and then, in Nietzsche's grand phrase, now you're ready for the gift-giving virtue. Now the gift-giving virtue can pour out of you, and you didn't even know that what would pour out and how you will shape it. So this back and forth has to be done. I will say that that for me, reading these novelists like Conrad and the Nostromo had a big effect on me. Melville, same way, because he's dealing with whales in the ocean and the panicked human responses to it. And the Tournier's Friday and even the Don DeLillo stuff, they all kind of, and Mary Shelley, they all open up our engagements with planetary processes. They challenge assumptions and they make you become disquieted with yourself for a while. But I want to add another item to this list if I can, and that is today, because things are moving so fast in some territories, I'm very interested in imbibing insights from what I would call philosophical journalists, journalists who are seeing a new problem or a problem that people have avoided, and they're knowing that it's going to require them to move across several disciplines to pursue it. And they also write in inspiring ways, in ways that get right in, move right inside the sensorium. And I'm thinking of my 2 most recent examples are David Quammen in his book, The Tangled Tree, where he carries us into this new work in evolutionary theory, where horizontal gene transfers are qualifying the tree-like model of evolution. And then his book that came out a year and a half before the recent pandemic, called Spillover, where he traces the history of viral spillovers and what kinds of things you have to do to come to terms with them, and how the scientists have to become anthropologists as they do. And then, of course, maybe perhaps a better known one is Elizabeth Colbert. So in The Sixth Extinction, in her newest book, Cloudless Sky, which I have in my study somewhere but haven't read yet, I'm thinking that today these philosophical journalists have to be added to my list. they help me move across boundaries that I had stopped at. That's all I can say at the moment, anyway.
Indeed, that's a lot of inspiration to bring and move Conrad studies into the planetary and food for thought for the humanities across disciplines more generally. But this is a beginning, as always, with us. We spoke of the shadow line as a tale of beginnings, and we hope that this discussion on a planetary Conrad, which is going to be part of a special issue of the Conradian on Conrad and the planetary, is stimulating and allows, Leuven reminds me, not only the young generation, but also the oldies, as she says, to contribute to this discussion. Indeed, because we need all the energies and forces that we can muster on board for this one. We are all not necessarily on the same ship, but on the same planet. The metaphor is overused, but we have to start to take it literally, I'm afraid. And I think that Bill Connolly's work, I highly recommend, Facing the Planetary. Check it out if you haven't done so yet. And all of his books that I mentioned are sources of inspiration. They've been for me for quite some time now, and they're fully at play in the Homo Mimeticus project, very often under different conceptual masks like the visceral and the mimeticus. But we are in constant dialogue. So thanks again, Bill, for your time. We'll be in touch again for the written version, and it's always a pleasure and an honor to be in dialogue with you. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Let me thank you for inviting me.
Thank
and
you.
There is a quotation from your book that I will end with, because I had intended to bring it up in our discussion, but you know how things go. On page 49, we in fact left with our image of the hurricane, with its power to madden the senses, to sink ships, to dash the very birds of the air to the ground. And so what I find going on in this book, in the Conrad book, is these spiral processes of mimesis from the human, non-human to the human, back to the non-human, and so forth. And so I've had a good time. Thank you for inviting me.